Whether Hank Marvin used flat-wound electric guitar strings back in his early years, and whether this has been a key part of achieving that early sound, has been a matter of active discussion for many years. And I first recall coming across it in the early part of the 2000s in the little book That Sound by Roberto Pistolesi. Since then, on the various chat sites, there's been much speculation about whether Hank did or did not use flat-wound strings originally, and indeed whether they've been used on some of their later numbers as well. It would be terrific if we could simply go to the local guitar shop and buy a set of strings as might have been fitted to Hank's guitar originally, but unfortunately these are no longer available. And despite considerable searching by various Shadows enthusiasts, it's not even clear whether Hank's original guitar would have been fitted with flat-wound strings or round-wound strings, and indeed what the composition of these might have been. In this regard, I and many others have asked Hank whether or not he did use flat-wound strings in the early days, and he's quite emphatic that he didn't. However, it was a long, long time ago, and just what his original Strat might have been fitted with is indeed unclear. In order to try and shed some light on this question, I've tried recording a number of tunes using both round-wound and flat-wound strings, and in each case tried to get as close as possible to the sound of the original Shadows recordings using equalisation and other studio techniques. There are two distinct aspects of a string that determine how it sounds. One is the tone, whether it's bright or mellow, whether it has rich or dry mids and so on, and the second is the string dynamic, which relates to the percussive attack, how long it sustains, and those sorts of dynamic factors. We've found in general that differences in tone can often, but not always, be nullified by the appropriate equalisation, while the dynamic aspects can sometimes be corrected by using old or aged strings, using those with polymer coatings, using a different guitar setup, or indeed a different string gauge or different picking style. However, the more you look into the question of string construction, the more it becomes apparent that it's really an unfair question to ask whether flat or wound were used. There are simply so many options for string construction and string materials, not to mention other complicating factors like guitar setup and indeed Hank's unique playing style, that it makes it really very difficult to reduce such a complex question down to simply were they rounds or were they flats. Nevertheless, it is a very interesting question to pursue, but before we get into listening to some examples of tunes played on both flats and round-wound strings, it's important to get a good understanding of all these subtleties of string construction. Firstly, we're concentrating only on the wound strings, which are the E, A, D, and for most instances the G or third string as well. These have a complicated construction where there is a core, usually of steel, that can either be round or hexagonal in cross-section, and over this is wound one or two layers of windings that may have the same or different compositions. The outermost layer may then be either round in cross-section or D-shaped in cross-section, or more like a flat tape, giving what's known as the round-wound strings, the half-round strings, or the flat-wound strings. The most important parameters here are therefore the core profile, whether hexagonal or round, the composition of the core, which is normally a plain steel, whether there are one or two layer wraps, the winding ratio, which is the ratio of core to wrap volumes, and the wrap composition, and finally whether the outer wrap is round, half-round or flat. With regard to the composition of the wrap, this can either be pure nickel, nickel-plated steel, stainless steel, various chrome alloys, and may or may not have a polymer coating over the whole string. The wrap composition is particularly important because it directly affects the tone of the string. the most mellow tone is produced by pure nickel wraps. Going to nickel-plated steel then gets you halfway between mellow and bright, and then finally the steel and stainless steel strings are the brightest of the lot. And on that scale there's a whole range between those two extremes. The shape of the outer wrap also has a very pronounced effect on the tone of the string. The round wound strings tend to be the brightest, and the flat wound strings have the most mellow tone. It's not surprising then that given all of these variables, there's a huge range of string sounds that can be achieved. And indeed, there's a lot of overlap that's possible between, for example, a slightly dull round wound string and a bright flat wound string that can sound very similar. Well, that's the background information we need. Now let's get back to the music of the Shadows. The obvious starting place is Apache, recorded on 17th of June 1960. Here, when you listen carefully, the sound is indeed quite percussive, and the bottom three strings are fairly mellow in tone. So it's quite conceivable that this track could have been recorded with flat wound strings, either that or very well used round wounds. I'll now give a couple of examples where we've used either of these so that we can hear the differences. The key things to listen to here are the tone of the note, how rich it is, what's the balance between the top end and the bottom end, and the dynamic of the note, how percussive is the attack and how long is the sustain of the note. I should mention that in all cases the strings we've used are 12 to 52s. So here is the Shadows again, followed by our attempt at recording it with some very old round wound elixirs. Here the string tone is pretty close to the original, as is the sustain of each note. If anything's lacking, it's a slight percussive attack. By nature of their construction, we would expect flat wound strings to provide this percussive attack. So here's that section again, recorded with some pure nickel flat wounds. Again, it's the Shadows first and then the flat wound second. Here we've pretty much managed to restore that percussive attack. What we've now lost, however, is the richness of sound, the strings sounding just a little bit too mellow. So let's move now to the bright end of the flat wound scale. Here's that same section again, recorded now with some polished stainless flat wounds. We've still got most of that nice percussive attack, but now the tone has suffered. In order to try and equalise it to make it sound as close to the Shadows, we've lost all the richness out of the mid-range. So what we need is something between those last two flat wound examples, and the obvious place to look is for a nickel-plated flat wound string. Here's that same section again recorded with such a string. For me, that very much nails the tone and the dynamic of the original. Let's go back and compare that one now with the one I showed first, which was the old round wound strings. First the round wound, then the nickel-plated flat wound. I think they're now both fairly close to the original, but to my ear the nickel-plated flat wound string just has the edge in tone and a slightly nicer percussive attack. So, does this mean that Hank used flat wounds when he recorded Apache back in 1960? I don't think the differences are large enough for us to be able to say. because the round wounds we used were old elixirs, but they're a coated string, and they weren't available in Hank's day, so if he did use old round wounds, they could well have been a lot more mellow than the ones we used, and they could have provided that extra percussive attack. I might also add that, not surprisingly, the higher parts of the melody that are played on the plain strings sounded very similar in all cases. From Apache to FBI, which was recorded on the 13th of August in 1960, the sound on the lower strings, the wound strings, remains quite percussive and relatively mellow. As with Apache, we can match the sound of FBI quite closely using either old round wound strings or flat wounds chosen to give the right balance between the percussive attack and the tone. Here's FBI played by Shadows. Here's the comparison between the Shadows and the old round wounds. Here I think there's a subtle difference in tone, with the round wounds not quite having the weight or body of the original. And here now is the Shadows followed by the flat wound strings. Here we went for the pure nickels to get that extra body. Here I've had to apply a little bit of treble boost just to get the brightness back in the string. It's interesting now to compare the round wound with the flat wound. Unfortunately, these two were recorded some time apart with different backings, but if one listens through that to the lead tone, I think they're both fairly much similar, again showing how much overlap there is between the characteristics of, in this case, an old round wound and a flat wound string. This same string characteristic appeared on their recordings up to Mustang, which was recorded on the 20th of August 1960. But there is then a distinct change in tone to a brighter sound and a longer sustain, with Theme from Giant, which was recorded 7th of October 1960 onwards. Here on, we seem to be able to better match the sound with round wound strings, the flat wounds just being a bit too percussive and in some cases mellow. During all this period, Hank was using the same guitar, that's the old 34-34-6, and amplifier, which was a two-tone AC-15. So we can attribute the differences we're hearing to either the strings and or changes made during the recording process. Probably the first direct evidence for Hank's use of round wound strings come with the pronounced string squeaks on Blue Star, most noticeable at about 90 milliseconds into the track. That tune was recorded at the same session as Frightened City in February 1961, so I'd guess that Hank used round wound strings definitely on that track as well. The recording of Blue Star and Frightened City coincided with Hank switching to his Rosewood Strat, so it's also possible that differences in that instrument are also responsible for some of the change of tone. For all the tracks after that period, we find that round wounds, whether slightly used or old, could give us a better match to the originals than flat wounds could. Although, as noted previously, it's possible to make one sound very much like the other. So if we're unable to say explicitly whether Hank used flats or rounds in the earliest days, what does all this mean for a musician trying to reproduce the sound and tone of those early recordings? I think the answer lies in the information we provided earlier in this discourse about the effects of string construction on the dynamics and the tone of the string. If you have a setup that's generally bright, and that might be the pickups or your amplifier or listening environment, then to reproduce the sound of the Shadows you'd probably need to go for a string that's more on the mellow end of the scale. Either maybe pure nickel round wounds or maybe a nickel coated flat wound string, or a string intermediate between those two which is partially round. If your setup is already sounding dull, then there'd be a benefit in moving more up to the brighter end of the string tone scale, going maybe from nickels to nickel plated or even all the way up to stainless, until you get that right balance of tone and string dynamic. I don't think there is any answer to the question, what is the best string to use? It depends entirely on how it fits in with the rest of your system and gives the required overall sound.